This video is to accompany the third topic, student notes. So if you could have your student notes and your question pack for our third topic, energy transfer, to accompany this video. So before we move into energy transfer in an ecosystem, I just want to remind you of one of the laws of energy. So energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be changed from one form to another. Kinetic energy can become thermal energy. So it's just reminding you that that's an absolute truth in science. So you've got to be very careful about the language that you choose, so you don't imply that energy is being destroyed in any way during the energy changes. Okay, so moving into your keynotes on page 4. So photosynthesis is, for ecosystems, the main route in which energy enters the ecosystem. So it's during the process of photosynthesis that plants synthesize organic compounds. So they make glucose, and they do this from atmospheric or aquatic carbon dioxide. Okay, they are autotrophs, so they're creating their own food, if you like, and as they do that, the light energy is being converted to chemical energy within the biomass of the plants. So what is biomass? Well, biomass, if you think about it in terms of our plants, of all the glucose produced in the light independent reactions, much of it will be used by the plant as a respiratory substrate. Okay, so it's going to be used to produce ATP, to then for that ATP to provide energy for all the biological processes involved in the plant, including its growth. But the rest of the glucose will be used to make other biological molecules. So think about it, we're going to take that glucose and convert it into amino acids, and then we're going to use those amino acids to build a protein that makes up some structural components of a cell. We might be adding beta glucose molecules together to build cellulose, microfibrils, to build the cell wall of new plant cells as the plant grows. So those biological molecules are actually part of the cells of the plant. And so that's what we're referring to when we're referring to biomass. Okay, so if you think about our biomass then, the energy that is trapped within those biological molecules, when the plant is eaten, that energy gets transferred up the food chain. So thinking about that word biomass then in your grey box, if you're asked to define it, it would be the biological molecules which make up an organism. But I want you to really think about that concept, because that's a big concept. So every living organism you know is made up of the biochemicals that we've studied. So our biological molecules that we've covered in our course, our carbohydrates. Oh, I've missed out lipids there as well, so we have lipids too. So all those biological molecules that make up the structure of the organism, that is what we refer to as its biomass. So if you consider all these molecules, then each one of them will have energy trapped within the bonds within that molecule. So when an organism eats another organism, that chemical energy is transferred in the molecules that are digested and then absorbed by that organism. Right, now let's pause here and see what you can remember of this topic from your GCSE studies. Okay, so you should unpause having had a go at answering these questions. So let's have a look at food chains to begin with. So what's the food chain, what does it show, and how many links do they have? So what does it show? Well, what is our food chain? I'll show that in a minute. What does it show? Well, it shows energy flow through the ecosystem, through the feeding relationships between different organisms or different species. So there's an example there. So we've got our nettles being eaten by our rabbit and our rabbit being eaten by our fox. So the arrows represent the flow of energy from what's being eaten to what is eating it. How many links will a food chain have? Well, what I hope you're recalling from GCSE is that these energy transfers between living organisms are not very efficient. So the energy that is successfully transferred within the biomass of one species to the next when it is eaten is very low. And so we get quite a large amount of energy loss at each trophic level, so at each feeding level. So it's not going to be very many links, okay? It depends on the ecosystem. Typically no more than 4. Sometimes you can have up to 5. They tend to be aquatic systems where the producer species is an algal population, and the algae are because they float on the surface of the water, they have a massive sort of surface area for trapping light, and so a really big biomass. So you can, in those ecosystems, because there's so much energy input into them, then you can get slightly longer food chains. But the reason that a food chain can't be any longer than that is because by the time we get to a secondary consumer, there has been that much energy lost from that food chain to the environment as heat, that there isn't enough energy left to sustain another trophic level on top. Okay, so then I asked you to recall what a food web is. So sometimes the examiner might represent food chains within an interconnected web. And this shows the energy flow through part of an ecosystem, giving you more information about the food chains within it. So this is an example from a GCSE textbook. Okay, so at GCSE as well, you studied the pyramids of number, biomass and energy. So I just want to recap those with you. So what did they show, and were there any limitations to them? Okay, so if we start with pyramids of number, so these are just graphs basically. If you think about what these pyramids are, they're a bar chart, but instead of representing the bars in a vertical fashion, the bars are just horizontal and stacked on top of each other. So it is just a graph, and we can read it like we read other bar charts, but it's the width of the bar that gives us the data. Okay, so a food chain doesn't give you quantitative information, but if you represent it as a pyramid of number, it starts to give us some idea of the energy transfer through that food chain. Okay, so we could draw a pyramid for our nettle, rabbit and fox food chain, and it'd look something like that. So we'd have lots of nettle plants sustaining a small population of rabbits, and then an even smaller population of foxes. So this would be population data in that area, and we would be using that to give us an idea about energy transfer. Okay, but the problem with just representing data as numbers of individuals, when you're trying to think about energy transfer through that ecosystem, through that food chain, is that quite a number of examples really. A period of number can be inverted in this way. Okay, so this is kind of a limitation of looking at pyramids of number if you're trying to think about energy transfer through an ecosystem. because it doesn't take into account the size of the organism. Okay, so if you think about this example here, an oak tree is a very large organism, and it can sustain many insects eating it, so many primary consumers. And then again, those primary consumers in number can sustain fewer secondary consumers. So you get this kind of weird inversion here at the bottom. So it's better if you can, but it takes a little bit longer, to consider biomass instead, because if you consider biomass, it takes into account the size of the organism. So if sometimes data is presented to you as pyramids of biomass, and pyramids of biomass give us a better sense of the energy transferred through a food chain, okay, because they are allowing us to compare the mass of the organisms. It's important that when we construct these pyramids, because we're making comparisons, we must use dry mass. So we do that because the water content will vary. So on page 4 in your keynotes, there's a bit of a reminder there about the importance of using dry biomass in these particular data representations. So because water content variables, if we just compare the biomass of species within a food chain, then we've got an unreliable comparison. So it's hard work though to do a dry mass. We'll come back to that in a minute. So pyramids based on biomass overcome the problem of organisms differing in size. So most are that shape. There are a couple of examples, and our examiner is really keen on just showing you a pyramid of biomass that can just invert, okay? And that's because a pyramid of biomass, when you create it, only represents the situation in that food chain at that given point in time. So if you've got populations that really fluctuate in number over a time period, then if you just capture a point within that month or that season where the producer numbers are lower than the consumer numbers, then that can give you an inversion in your biomass, because biomass can fluctuate. The one example the examiner likes, and you'll see this in your question pack and in homeworks, is the one about phytoplankton. So they're producers, and that's the producer, so it's an algae in an aquatic system. At any one point, they can have a lower biomass than the consumer, okay? They have the ability to multiply very rapidly in a short space of time. So the consumer can have a greater biomass because we get these sort of phytoplankton blooms. Okay, so how do we calculate dry biomass then? So have a little think, stop the video and write down what you think you'd have to do. Okay, so you should have unpaused. It's actually on page 4 in your keynotes. So on page 4 in your keynotes, it talks about what you'd need to do. Okay. So the final way you would have been presented this data at GCSE, and actually looking at the exam questions more commonly now, was as a pyramid of energy. So these consider the energy utilised in a given area at a given time. They're the most accurate way to depict energy transfer because we are depicting the amount of energy in each trophic level. So they're absolutely always going to be pyramid shaped because energy is lost at each trophic level in a food chain, so lost to the environment. So the bar importantly shows the energy at each level, so you can extract the data from reading the width of the bar. And the producer bar represents the amount of light energy converted to chemical energy. So you can always get your sort of energy input into the ecosystem from that bottom bar. And the units are always in energy per area per unit time. So that's usually kilojoules per meter square per year, but it can be kilojoules per hectare per year. As long as it's got all those elements to the units, it has to have an energy, which is going to be kilojoules because these are big values, an area and a time frame. Okay, so remember those units because you get a mark point for giving that unit. But it's very difficult to obtain the data. So if you think about an energy pyramid, now we're actually showing how much energy there is in, if we think about our nettle example, all the nettles growing in that area at that time, then all the energy in all the rabbits in that area at that time, and then all the energy in all the foxes in that area at that time. So you'll need a sample that would be representative, a dry biomass, and then you will calculate the amount of energy in that biomass. And then you'll have to calculate that up to the amount of energy in the whole organism. And then you'll need to estimate the number of each organism in that area at that time and times that value up. So hard work, difficult to obtain. However, we will be given that data because we can do nice calculations from the pyramids themselves. Okay, so having a look then in your keynotes, if you turn to page 5, the examiner does expect you to have an awareness of how you would practically work out how much energy there was within the dry biomass sample that you've got. So this links to something you did at GCSE as well. Okay, so it's a practical experiment that you may have done with a bit of fancy kit like this, or you might have done with a Coke can. So this is calorimetry. Okay, so this is working out how many calories there are, how much energy there is in biological material. And what you've got to do is you burn your material, a sample of your material, in an oxygen rich environment. So ideally in one of these bits of kit here, which is a calorimeter, or calorimeter, but you can adapt a Coke can to do the same thing. So you might have done that at school. And it's very simple. There is a reservoir within the kit with a known volume of water. As the organic matter is burnt inside the kit, the heat energy released is absorbed by the water, and the temperature change can be used to calculate how much energy has been released. So that's using the constant, which is our specific heat capacity of water. You don't need to know the formula or anything. If you want to recap it, there's loads of GCSE revision videos on calorimetry showing different variations on this with slightly different bits of kit. But it's you knowing that that's possible. We can use this kit to measure the amount of energy in a sample of material. So it's not a compulsory practical, it's a suggested practical, so it's something that we could do, but you're not going to be tested on it directly. So just having an awareness is okay. Right, so bit of a GCSE question then to get you warmed up for the topic. So if you pause here and have a go at the question and then return. Okay, so if you've returned now, hopefully you've identified that our primary consumer will be our second trophic level, so our moth caterpillars. You've been asked to calculate the percentage efficiency of the transfer from the moth caterpillars to the robins. Okay, so there's our moth caterpillar and there is our robin. Now, if you remember from your GCSE studies, when you are doing energy transfer, and this is whether it's a kettle or an organism in terms of the energy transfer, it's always the energy after the transfer, so in this case in our robin, divided by the energy available before the transfer, so in this case our moth caterpillars, times 100. And that will give us the percentage of energy transferred from this trophic level to this trophic level, which if I get my calculator, okay, so that is 11.4%. Okay, so what about units for our pyramid above? Well, it's an energy pyramid, which I now note it doesn't say anywhere, but it's an energy pyramid, so these are energy values. So kilojoules per meter per year. Okay. In a pyramid of a number for this food chain, explain why the beech tree block would be smaller. Okay, so the beech tree block would be smaller because beech trees are large. Okay, so a large beech tree can sustain many caterpillars. So that's why, because it's a large organism. It's got a, well, in fact, if we're at A level, I suppose we should say it's got a large biomass. Okay, so give 2 ways energy is lost between the moth caterpillars and the robins. So this is drawing on some of your GCSE knowledge and dusting it off. Could you remember any? So between the moth caterpillars and the robins, okay, now caterpillars are quite digestible. So you're not really going to get any mark points for saying that, you know, there's big bits of them like skulls and things not being eaten, because the whole moth caterpillar will be eaten by the robin. But not all of it will be absorbed by the robin, so there'll be losses in the robin's feces, and this is our robin's biomass, so some of the energy will have been lost as heat during respiration for our robin as well. Okay, so don't worry if you didn't recall that last one. Well, we'll do some recapping now because there isn't that much extra, to tell you the truth, in the A-level content. It's much more about AO2 thinking, as we will keep referring to, being cautious about the species that you're talking about and not just having rote answers. Okay, so moving on to page 5 and our A-level content for energy transfer. Okay, so on page 5 it says pyramids of energy are pyramid shaped because energy is lost at each trophic level. So we're only really considering pyramids of energy at A level, but there are questions about the other 2 types of pyramids based on your GCSE knowledge. Okay, so sort of application questions. So plants, thinking about now how light energy enters the ecosystem, so how energy enters the ecosystem as light within photosynthesis. Plants only convert between 1 and 3% of the light energy that is available to them into chemical energies within organic molecules. So of the light energy available to the plant in the ecosystem, it converts a very, very small percentage to the chemical energy stored in glucose. So stop here, Use your knowledge of photosynthesis, so this is where we are at A-level, it's all about application, to suggest why that's such a small number, and explain why some ecosystems have a 3% efficiency and others only have a 1%. Okay, so you should have started back with me now. So let's have a look at some of these ideas. Okay, so of the light that actually reaches the surface of the leaf, and not all of it will strike a leaf, some is actually just reflected. So you know already the wavelength, or the colour of light that is reflected, because that's why they're green, the leaves. So the green light is reflected. So those wavelengths aren't utilised at all in the process of photosynthesis because they're reflected by the chlorophyll. Some of the energy is not absorbed by the chlorophyll, but it's used to evaporate water, so that energy is lost. So it just doesn't strike the chlorophyll, it strikes water molecules, and that energy is used to evaporate the water from the leaf. And some doesn't strike the chlorophyll, and it just literally transmits straight through the leaf, which makes sense if you think about being inside a woodland. It's not pitch black, sunlight penetrates the canopy. And then if we think about the energy absorbed by the chlorophyll, not all the wavelengths are used. Okay, so some of the energy is the wrong, some of the light energy is the wrong wavelength for photosynthesis in that plant, depending on what accessory pigments it has. And if you have a look at kind of experimental data sometimes that's given to you, you can see that different colours of light result in different amounts of photosynthesis. Okay, now this is giving us a measurement called primary productivity, which we'll come back to, but you can clearly see that when you've got all wavelengths of light, you've got the highest productivity, which is a measure of part measure of photosynthesis. Red and blue, you're getting a nice high productivity as well. Whereas with green, because most of it is going to be reflected and not utilised, then we've got a very low. So sometimes you might be given data sets to interpret, to help you come up with your ideas about why that 1 to 3% efficiency exists. And even if the light energy is the right wavelength, it does not mean that when it's absorbed by the chlorophyll, that light energy will be converted into chemical energy in the glucose, because there are other factors like carbon dioxide and temperature which could limit the rate of photosynthesis. So if you think about when the light energy is absorbed and the electrons are excited, that does mean that we've got the light dependent reactions happening. Okay, but if we've got a limited amount of carbon dioxide or the temperature is low, the light independent reactions might be happening quite slowly. So of all that energy that is being used to excite electrons and then to move protons across the thylakoid membrane, and for the protons to come back through the thylakoid membrane through the ATP synthase to make ATP, can only make that ATP as fast as we've got returned ADP from its use in the light independent reactions. So we will end up losing more of that energy to heat rather than to producing ATP if the light independent reactions are slow. Okay, so that would limit how much glucose you would produce. So now, why then do you think some areas of the world, some ecosystems have a higher efficiency rating here, so they are able to convert a greater percentage of the light energy available to them to chemical energy in the form of organic molecules within the plant? Well, it links again to these factors. So in parts of the world, and obviously light as well, we might have, I don't know, think of the Amazon rainforest. We've got a higher light intensity, higher temperatures, and so the rate of photosynthesis is going to be faster, and that will give you a better efficiency value. Okay, so if you're comparing different ecosystems in terms of the amount of energy they're able to convert during photosynthesis into glucose within the plants, then you need to think about everything you know about photosynthesis and all the factors that could be limiting in an ecosystem that only manages 1% efficiency, and where those factors might be better in an ecosystem where you've got a 3% efficiency. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and I'm going to ask you to open up your question pack to question 1. Okay, question 1, just part A at the moment. Okay, so have a read. The percentage of light energy trapped by the producers is very low. Give 2 reasons why. I want you to give your strongest reasons. You can use your keynotes now if you need to. Okay, and write your answer. Pause me while you do. Okay, so you should have written your answer. So now we're going to go through the answer. Okay, so here is your mark scheme. You can see it's very extensive. Now, you might want to make the mark scheme indicated somewhere in your keynotes. So we have got this information in your keynotes, but this is a new spec mark scheme. So because some of the light energy is reflected by water or reflected by the producer. Now, whether they're going to give that second mark point without you saying reflected from, I would say number 2 and number 4 are basically the same thing. Okay, so the idea of having the wrong wavelength. So if the light energy is reflected, it's because it's green light and that's the wrong wavelength for use by the chlorophyll. So you've got to be careful to write 2 very different ideas here. Okay, so transmitted is a good extra one because that's different. So if you've got a reflected by the water or reflected by the chlorophyll because it's the wrong wavelength, something like that, then you could also say some of the light energy is transmitted, it misses the chloroplast. Make sure you put that detail in. Okay, you can also say that some of the energy is used to drive the reactions of photosynthesis, and there's some heat energy lost during photosynthesis. So if you think about when the protons move down that the gradient back out of the thylakoid disc, and that energy is transferred into used to catalyze the reaction between ADP and phosphate to make ATP, that reaction is not 100% efficient. There's a lot of heat loss to the environment during that process. So that can happen. You can talk about that as well as an extra mark point there. And the fact that you could name another limiting factor. So you'll need 2 really strong ones. Okay, so I've given you 4 bullet points. I've given you some of the lights reflected. I don't think you get it without saying energy now after light every time. So you might want to put energy after light every time. Some might be absorbed by the atmosphere. Now that's no longer coming up on the mark schemes, as you can see. So you might want to bracket that one in your keynotes. Some of the light's the wrong wavelength. Maybe put a bit more detail in. So green being the wrong wavelength, green coloured light being the wrong wavelength. Some light doesn't fall on the chlorophyll. It misses the chlorophyll, doesn't fall on the chloroplast, is transmitted through. You could add in, and then I would put in all the limiting factors, and I would add into my keynotes used to drive reactions of photosynthesis or heat. I would put actually heat energy lost in photosynthesis reactions if you want an extra one there. Okay, so quite a lot of different answers given to maximum. So in your keynotes then, there's a name for the energy which is successfully converted to organic molecules. So in other words, that is converted into glucose. And that is the gross primary production of the ecosystem. Okay, so that is the, if you like, the rate energy is incorporated into glucose within that ecosystem by the process of photosynthesis. So that's your gross primary productivity. Okay, and again, we give this in terms of units of energy per area per year. So it's always in kilojoules per meter square per year. Okay, so just before we move on to net primary production or productivity, we are just going to pause here and just add maybe into your keynotes if you feel you need to. That percentage efficiency value for photosynthesis, that 1 to 3%, sometimes you might be asked to calculate it. So it is your gross primary production that you use in that calculation. So the percentage efficiency of photosynthesis is measured by how much energy is trapped into glucose by photosynthesis, so the gross primary production, divided by the amount of light energy available to the plant, that's striking the plant, times 100. So you might want to make a little note of that in your keynotes, somewhere near that 1 to 3%. If you were ever asked to calculate it, it's using that gross primary production value and you're dividing it by the total amount of energy available. Okay, it's no different to the efficiency calculations you'll do all the way through the rest of the ecosystem. As you know, they are always energy available after the transfer divided by energy available before times 100. So it's just the same formula. Okay, so now I'm going to ask a slightly different question. So only about 50% of the light energy converted to chemical energy by photosynthesis, so that's the successfully converted to glucose energy, is available to the herbivore as plant biomass. So why? I want you to have a go at writing some ideas. Why? What factors do you think affect that figure? Okay, so let's have a look. Okay, so the energy is absorbed by the chlorophyll in the plant and used in photosynthesis. Okay, and we said that there's some heat loss during that process. It might not be the right wavelength. Some of the light energy is used to evaporate water. There's lots of reasons why that wasn't very efficient, but that resulted in a certain amount, between 1 and 3% of the light energy available being converted into glucose within the plant. But then you've got to think about that plant. Okay, so some of that energy will be used to build plant biological molecules, other molecules for the growth of the biomass of the plant, but quite a substantial amount of it will just be used in the mitochondria as a respiratory substrate. And during that process of converting glucose, energy trapped in glucose, into energy trapped within ATP, and then using that energy in energy transfer molecule and the energy trapped within it to fuel biological processes throughout the plant. All of that means a significant amount of the glucose, the energy trapped in glucose made from photosynthesis, will not be transferred into the biomass of the plant. It will be lost as heat energy in the process of respiration. Okay, so that accounts for a big chunk. And the difference between those that figure before and after respiration is called the net primary productivity. Okay, so just like in my wage packet where I get my gross pay and then the government takes a big slice for tax and national insurance, and I've got my pension contributions and other staff deductions, at the end I take my net pay home. The plant, in exactly the same way, has its gross primary production, which is the total amount of glucose it can make during photosynthesis, but it has to use a substantial amount of that energy in respiration. So if we do our gross primary production minus our respiration losses, that will give us our energy in the biomass of the plant. So in other words, the energy trapped in the biomass, which we call the net primary production. Okay, so that is the energy stored in the biomass of the plant, and it's that energy that is available to the next trophic level, to our herbivores. Okay, so you're moving on to page 6 in your keynotes. Okay, so that's the energy available, but unfortunately for our herbivore, of the energy available, there are also large losses in this link in the food chain. Just a quick stop. So our net primary productivity or production was the rate energy is incorporated into biomass. So remember, that's the difference. This is now trapped in the biomass. It's still got the same units though, kilojoules per meter square per year. Okay, and to calculate it, that's really important that you've got that formula in your minds. So our gross primary production minus respiration equals our net primary production. As I showed you earlier, we might be given data on productivity. So now we know what these productivities mean. This is net productivity for different ecosystems, and you can see that in the desert we don't have a lot of light energy converted successfully to biomass of the plant, which is what you would expect. In a tropical forest you would. So sometimes at A level, it's all about thinking about the factors in different ecosystems that would affect the GPP, whether or not photosynthesis rate's higher. But also you've got to remember that increase in temperature might increase respiration rate as well. So it's a balance between those two factors. And there's some other ways they can represent the data. Okay, so you might get net primary productivity in freshwater in an ecosystem. This is during spring, this is at different depths. Okay, so obviously the deeper in the water we go, then we're going to have less plant species, and so that might be our explanation for that data trend. But what it's looked like in the exam so far has been quite complicated data sets where you are being expected to use your quite simple formula, so your GPP minus R equals MPP, but they've given you your net rate of photosynthesis, if you like, as your NPP on the left hand side of the graph, and then you've been given your respiration on the right hand side of the graph. And they asked in this question for you to calculate gross primary production at medium light intensity. So you did have to go to medium light intensity and a certain temperature. I think it might have been 20 degrees. You had to read off your net rate of photosynthesis. So that was your net primary production. And then you had to use your other line, which was your respiration line, at the same temperature, and read off on the other axes on the right hand side, and then you had to add them together to come up with GPP. Okay, so we will have a go at that one in class. So it's application of the formula, not just knowing the formula or the equation. So we have our net primary productivity of production, which is available to the next trophic level. So that's our herbivore, okay? And remember, this is because of all the energy trapped in the glucose. Some has been used now in respiration by the plant, and what we've got left in the biomass of the plant is our net primary production. But not all of that energy will transfer to our herbivore's biomass. Okay, there's a large number of losses in this trophic level transfer. So why? Okay, so why? So think about our herbivore. Why are there such large losses when the herbivore eats the plant? Why is so little of the energy trapped in the biomass of the plant going to make it all the way to being trapped in the biomass of that organism? Okay, well, first of all, a plant is made up of large amounts of indigestible material. Okay, so it's important here to name cellulose if you can. So because cellulose is indigestible by a large number of species, that energy trapped in cellulose will be passed out in the feces of the organism. Not all the plant will be eaten. This is better in aquatic ecosystems. So if it's algae floating in water, then that might not be a reason in that particular context for the energy to be lost, because the fish can eat the whole of the algae. But for a lot of terrestrial ecosystems, the plant might have a root system that's not accessible to be eaten, or there might be spines, bits of the plant that are not edible. Okay. The consumer itself will need to use its digested and absorbed molecules as respiratory substrates. Okay, so there will be massive amounts of energy lost in the consumer in its own respiration. Okay, and when that happens, respiration itself and the use of the ATP in all the biological processes, those are not efficient, and a lot of energy is actually lost as heat energy from respiration. Okay. Some of the energy will be also, as you can see in your keynotes, be lost in excretion through the urine as well. So that can be a mark point, depends on the herbivore though. Okay, so it's important as an A-level student not just to rattle off the same bullet points whenever you're explaining why there's energy losses at this trophic level. You need to consider the species that you're talking about, the ecosystem, and make sure that the suggestions that you make are correct in that context. Okay, energy that does go on to form the new biomass is then available to the second trophic level as the net secondary production. Okay, so energy stored in the biomass of a consumer is available to the next energy level. The next energy level, you might think, has got a better transfer. I think that if you think about carnivores eating herbivores now, they are more likely to consume more of the organism, although there might be parts that they can't eat. If you've got an animal, you've no cellulose, so there's not any indigestible matter now, so you get a better transfer because it's mainly protein, and the protein is completely digestible. You can absorb the amino acids, and so that transfer can be a bit better. Okay, so it's important that you keep the context of the trophic level also in mind when you're talking about these transfers. Okay, but I'll show you some examples of that. So we'll pause there and we'll just think about our primary consumer for the moment, our herbivore. Back into question 1. But part B. So the biomass of the primary consumer is less than the biomass of the producer. Explain why. Okay, so you should have had a go at that one. So you're just applying your knowledge of the inefficiency of that energy transfer. So the reason the biomass of the consumer is so much less than the producer is because of the energy losses during the energy transfer. So these are the things that were on the MARTA scheme. So we've got loss of energy, heat energy loss, okay, in respiration. So if you'd have talked about there's a lot of energy lost as heat energy to the environment during respiration, you've got 2 mark points. If you'd have said that there's lots of indigestible parts like cellulose that just are lost in the feces and go to the decomposers, that would have got you a mark point. If you'd have said it's lost in excretion in urine or even carbon dioxide, you'd have got a mark point there. So you can add some additional ideas if you want to your keynotes. You can add the carbon dioxide if you like, but remember to keep it in context. Okay. Right, so thinking about our trophic levels then, every level we've got a loss, but this diagram shows that really between your plant and your herbivore, you've got a massive amount of energy loss because of that inefficiency in the cellulose within the plant not being able to be digested, and so a lot of energy lost in the feces. But you can still see there's a massive energy loss here between our primary consumer when the carnivore eats it. So, you know, you've still got, although it's a more digestible and absorbable molecules, so you haven't got the same indigestible material mark point, all the other mark points still stand. Okay, so that idea that not all of the herbivore can be eaten, some of the energy is lost in excretion, so producing carbon dioxide and urine. Some of the energy may be lost in the feces as well, okay, but not as great an amount as in the herbivore's feces, but also a massive energy loss in to the environment is heat during respiration. And as you can see with these, the kind of figures you're looking at, so we've got a massive sort of drop here, 1%, and then it's kind of like a 10% transfer, okay, between trophic levels. So not great shakes, which is why we start to run out of energy for any more trophic levels at the top of that food chain. Okay, so what else can the examiner ask you? They do like asking that question, so I've put that at the bottom of page 6. Summary that energy transfer is inefficient and results in large losses at each trophic level, as I've just shown you. Food chains are therefore no more than 4 or 5 levels, as there's not enough energy to support a breeding population at a higher trophic level. Okay, so what can we be asked to do? As you can see, there's not much difference from our GCSE knowledge base in energy transfer. Well, you're still going to be asked to do these kind of energy transfer calculations. As you'll see when we look in the question pack, they add a little bit more problem solving to them just to make the demand a little bit higher. But on page 7, I've given you some worked examples to remind you of how to do those energy transfer calculations. Okay, so if you're calculating the efficiency of an energy transfer, just like we did in the GCSE example at the start of the video, it is the energy available after the transfer divided by the energy available before times 100. Okay, so in your keynotes you've got an example of this, the energy transfer after, so this is if the percentage efficiency of energy transfer between the primary and the secondary consumers was required, then you would go to the data and you would find the energy available after the transfer, so that's what the energy in the biomass of the secondary consumer, so in this case 714 kilojoules per meters per year. Then you would need the energy available before the transfer, which is the energy in the biomass of the primary consumer, which was 4,032 kilojoules per meter square per year. And then, of course, you just divide the energy in the biomass of the secondary consumer by the energy that was initially available in the primary consumer biomass, and then times it by 100, so it gives us 17.7%. So there's a few examples of straightforward calculations like that within our A-level biology, but the demand of those questions is probably around the DC grade boundary. Okay, so when we do our remote session on this, we will be concentrating on more difficult examples, but we can have a go at some simple ones in a minute. Okay, so if we have a look at this GCSE example, so we've been asked to work out the percentage efficiency between the producers, so that's A, and the consumer, primary consumer, which is B. But they've given us our data in a slightly different way. They've given us the energy transferred and the energy lost. So we need to add those back together to give us the total biomass energy. So that will be the energy in the biomass of the primary producer. And if you think about our transferred energy before the losses and everything else, that's going to be 500. Okay. So we're just doing 500 divided by 5,000 times 100. So giving us a 10% transfer. Okay, so that's just a GCSE example, but if that's what they can do in GCSE questions, then it's unlikely that you're just going to get straight data. And so sometimes you're going to have to do something similar and work out your value for the energy before and the energy after the transfer. Okay, so now if I can ask you to move back to page 6 in your keynotes, there's just one last little formula in the just in the middle of the page in the grey box, and that is our net primary productivity or production, but this is in the context of our herbivore or our carnivore. Okay, so it still means the same thing, so it's still the energy that's stored in the new biomass. Okay, so it includes the idea of after respiratory losses, but now because we're not talking about a plant, we're thinking about this being equal to the food ingested. Okay, because these are heterotrophic organisms, we have to eat either plants or animals, so there's food ingested, and the losses now are still respiratory losses. Okay, but for animals we've got losses in our feces as well. Okay, so slightly different to our plant calculation, which of course was that our net primary production for plants was our gross primary productivity minus respiration. So that was for our first level of the ecosystem, if you like, and now we're just considering how this differs a little as we move to animal species. Okay, so here is our first animal. Okay, so here we've got our grazing cow, I think, yes. So we're applying our knowledge now to work out net production, so the amount of energy trapped in the biomass, or we're doing some problem solving calculations. This is the kind of thing that we get in our A-level. So this is our food, our energy available. Okay, so that's the energy available to be eaten. This is the energy loss in the urine and the feces. This is the energy that of the food that was eaten was absorbed by the organism, okay, and there are its respiratory losses, okay. So we're not straightforwardly just blindly applying the net production formula, we're just using it as a way to think our way through, okay. So we've got our respiration losses up here, and we've got our losses in the feces here, okay. What we want to calculate is what amount of energy makes it into the biomass there, okay. And we could work out all sorts of things in terms of efficiency and things, but that's what we're interested in. So do you want to have a go at calculating that for me? Okay. Okay, so it should be 125 kilojoules. Okay, so let's have a think about how we did that. Simply take the absorbed food and take away the losses in respiration, and that's what gave us what was left in the biomass. Okay, so don't expect to just be given data in a straightforward way where you'd just be recalling okay, because they can give, like they did in this question, the data slightly differently. So we've got not the ingested food, but of the ingested food, what was absorbed. Okay, so it's not going to be as straightforward as learn that and just apply it. This is more giving you a context to work from, or a starting point to work from. Okay, so the next question would be, what's the efficiency of the energy transfer for this herbivore from the food that from the energy available in its food to its biomass. So now we've got our biomass, we can calculate that. Okay, oops, as okay, so the energy available before the transfer, okay, energy that's successfully transferred, so energy available after the transfer, so made it to the biomass. So it's biomass divided by the energy input times 100, it's a 4% energy transfer. Okay, so I want you to go back into your keynotes now, not your keynotes, your question pack, and find question 6 to have a go at, and then we'll join together to share the answer to this. Okay, so we want to calculate, first of all, complete the following equation for the energy used in the production of new tissue. Use only the letters C, so that's C is your food in, F, U and R. Okay, so C is our ingested food. Okay, so that's minus, and you can do this in any way that makes sense, all of the losses. Okay, so you don't have to have it in brackets like that. You could have just minus F minus R minus U. Okay, so then in this one we're calculating P, so it's in much the same way. We've got of our absorbed food, absorbed energy even. We've got our respiration losses here, so okay, and remember though this time you've got that loss and that loss to take away, so and okay, so minus those two losses, and so it is 3.74. Okay, right, so then it gives you a bit of a flavour of where we're going with these energy transfer questions, because it gets a little bit more difficult in the next part of this. We'll leave this for the moment, okay, and then we'll have a go at B together. You can have a go at it now if you like, and then see if you've got it right when we're doing this together. Okay, so a bit of an energy transfer review now. Okay, so what was the difference between gross primary production and net primary production? Okay, so start and write your ideas. Okay, rejoin and then check your answer. So we've got GPP is the light energy fixed into organic molecules by photosynthesis, whereas NPP is the GPP minus the plant's respiratory losses. So NPP equals GPP minus R. Why is the GPP only 1% of light energy available to the plant? Write your ideas down. Okay, and review. Not all light energy is trapped in photosynthesis. Some's the wrong wavelength. The efficiency of photosynthesis is low because of limiting factors such as temperature. There are heat losses in the reactions as well. And light energy may not hit the chloroplast. It might be transmitted through. So I've kind of put them as the very, very different ideas there. So if I wanted to give two, I'd maybe give two of those and make them nice and detailed. You can all take those down if you want to, just pause. Okay, and then why is the energy transfer from a plant biomass to the herbivore biomass inefficient? Okay, so pause and finish your answer and then rejoin. Okay, to go through. Not all the plant will be eaten, so for roots, etc., now be careful because that's only in some context. Cellulose is difficult to digest, okay, so you get large losses in the feces. And there's a large amount of the biological molecules absorbed that are used in respiration, and that means that we've got energy loss to the environment as heat from that process. Okay, have a stop and think for a moment. So we've talked about, for the consumer energy transfers, that the herbivore transfer is less efficient because of, well, we'll recap that in a minute. But we've also want you to think now about all consumers. Will they have the same respiratory demands? Is there anything the examiner could do in the stem of the question that makes you, when you're comparing energy efficiencies or transfers, need to take into account some other information? Okay, so what about this idea? What if you've got a cold-blooded species versus a warm-blooded species? Which one's going to have the higher respiratory losses? Well, of course, it's going to be the warm-blooded individuals, okay? And smaller warm-blooded individuals have a larger surface area, so they have greater heat loss across their surface and so have higher respiratory demands. So for those kind of species, there's going to be even less energy available in their biomass to the next trophic level because they're going to use more energy in their own respiration. So if we were comparing these two here, this guy here would have a much higher respiratory demand because he's smaller and so he's got a larger surface area to volume ratio than this guy over here. So the rabbit would have a higher respiratory demand because he's losing, or she's losing, lots more heat across her surface because it's larger in comparison to her volume. So that's the kind of thing that they might stick into a question just to make you think a little bit more. Okay, now these are both herbivores, remember, so they've both got that kind of that loss. Okay, right, so I'm going to give you a task now. You're going to have to pause the video on the student responses and then have a go at marking and giving feedback, and then watch my marking and feedback and compare. Okay, so there's 3 questions. The percentage of light energy trapped by the producers is low. Give 3 reasons why. The biomass of the primary consumers is less than the biomass of the producers. Explain why. And explain why a food chain rarely contains more than 4 trophic levels. Okay, so review the student's response. The percentage of light energy trapped by the producers is low. Give 3 reasons why. Okay, let's review the answer together. So, the producers only absorb some light energy which strikes them and is used in photosynthesis. We'll get no mark points at all. Okay, so we need to have detail. So they need to say some of the light energy is the wrong wavelength to be used in photosynthesis. So they might even suggest green being reflected. They need to be able to say that some of the light energy might be transmitted through the plant, so it does not strike the chloroplast or chlorophyll. They need to have detail in about, so here it says only light energy used in photosynthesis is converted to chemical energy within the biomass, and so trapped, yeah, but not answering the question. So what stops that being very much is what they're asking. Why is that really rubbish? So this is all GPP. Okay, so it's why the GPP is so low. Your gross primary production. So you can also say that there's heat loss during the processes, the reactions, photosynthesis reactions to the environment. We can say that wrong wavelength. Oh, other limiting factors. Factors like carbon dioxide concentration and temperature might reduce the rate of photosynthesis. Okay, so that would be a much stronger answer. Now, the other thing they've done is they've talked at the end about respiratory losses. Now, that isn't really indicated because they're just talking about the energy trap. So they're talking about the gross primary production, not of the light trap that is available to the next trophic level, because then that would be a reference to net primary production, and you would include your respiratory losses by the plant. So there's no credit actually for that last line because it's not in the context of this question. Okay, let's have a look at the next one. So the biomass of the primary consumers is less than the biomass of the producers. Explain why. So the biomass, so the primary consumer might not be able to eat all the producer's biomass. This is true, okay. So it might not be, it depends on the context, but if it is, give examples. Okay, a large amount of the biomass of a plant is cellulose, which is difficult to digest, and so lots of chemical energy is lost in the feces. I'll give that, okay, because that's really nice and detailed. The primary consumer will use some of the chemical energy it absorbs when it eats to fuel its own respiration, to move and reproduce. Okay, what did you think of that bit? Okay, it's 2 GCSE. So you can say the chemical energy that it absorbs when it eats, but to fuel its own respiration is too noddy. Okay, so you need to have that you've got heat loss during respiration okay, to get that mark point. So we want 4 mark points. Okay, now there might be an extra detail mark point sometimes for mentioning cellulose. Okay, but we haven't had loss in urine or which could get us an extra mark point. Okay, so explain why a food chain rarely contains more than 4 trophic levels. As each energy transfer within the food chain is inefficient and there are energy losses at each trophic level, for example in the waste and during respiration, there is not enough energy left to be transferred to a 5th trophic level and support a further consumer within this food chain. Okay, so that's pretty good in that we've got both examples and why that would limit the food chain. So just maybe putting feces and urine in there and heat loss in respiration might just strengthen that mark point up a little bit more. Okay, so the final bit of the keynotes that I want to cover is at the top of page 8. Okay, so at the top of page 8 you've got an AO2 application. So in our specification it says students should appreciate the ways in which production is affected by farming practices designed to increase efficiency of energy transfers. So what I want you to do now is to think about how a farmer reduces respiratory losses in their animals. We've already thought about how farmers increase yield of crops. So this is really thinking about improving energy transfers for animal species in meat production in farming. Okay, so let me show you some pictures to sort of stimulate a little bit of thought. Okay, so there are things that we do in farming practices now to ensure that we get the best energy transfer we can to our animal to result in the best yield for the farmer, so the greatest meat production. Okay, so one example is shown here in terms of what we feed animals in meat production. Okay, so we can feed them a very high protein, sort of easy digestible food source, which means that we reduce the energy losses that take place in the feces. So we reduce energy losses by the feces by feeding animals easy digestible foods. Other things we do is we reduce energy losses by respiration by keeping animals warm and limiting their movement. So you can see lots of pens and sort of keeping animals inside. So all of that is to reduce losses via respiration. We also treat animals with antibiotics, and that helps to reduce potential respiratory losses fighting infections. And we have also, by keeping animals inside, simplified the food chain. So it's literally from the animal eating what it eats to then us eating it. So we've removed predators to reduce losses to non-human food chains. Okay, so we've covered all of the core content in the student notes, and what I'd like you to do now is to spend some time doing your student revision questions. Use your keynotes in the video to answer those questions in full in the back of your student notes in preparation for our next lesson. Thank you.